The story begins on a quiet Sunday morning in a small town in Texas. The church bell rings softly, calling the faithful to prayer. Men in dust-covered boots remove their hats as they step through the old wooden doors. Women in long dresses bow their heads, whispering prayers of peace and forgiveness. And there, sitting in the front pew, clean, calm, and dressed in a black coat, is James Brown Miller. He looks like a man of God. He holds a small Bible in one hand, his hat in the other. His eyes are closed, lips moving silently as if speaking to the Lord himself. To the townspeople, he is a model citizen, polite, respectful, and deeply religious. They call him Deacon Jim. But they don't know that under that neat black coat, he hides a steel breastplate, and inside that quiet heart, he hides something much darker. This is the story of James Brown Miller, the man who prayed before every murder. The man who carried a Bible in one hand and a shotgun in the other. The man history calls Killer Miller. James Brown Miller was born on October 25, 1861, in Van Buren County, Arkansas. He came into a world that was hard, wild, and violent. The Civil War had just begun to tear the country apart. When Miller was only a few years old, his family moved west, hoping for a better life on the Texas frontier. Life in Texas was rough. There were no laws in many places, only guns and courage. Miller's father tried to farm the land, but times were hard. Then one night, when Jim was still a boy, tragedy struck. His parents were murdered, shot down by an unknown man. No one was ever punished. The killer vanished, and the case went cold. Jim and his brothers were left alone in a cruel world, forced to live with their grandparents. That night changed him forever. Some say it broke something inside him. Others say it awakened something dark that was already there. From that day on, Jim became a quiet boy, too quiet. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and watched people with cold, careful eyes. He learned early that justice didn't always come from the law. Sometimes you had to take it yourself. As he grew older, Jim became polite and disciplined. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, and never used bad language. People trusted him. They saw a good, God-fearing man, someone who prayed before every meal and never missed church. But behind that calm face, he was learning another skill, the art of killing. He practiced shooting until his aim was perfect. He studied how men walked, how they reached for their guns, how fear showed in their eyes. He knew how to look gentle while planning your death. They said Miller could look a man in the eye, smile, and then pull the trigger without blinking. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't hate it either. For him, it was simply business, clean, quiet, and profitable. When he was 23, his dark side finally appeared. In 1884, in the town of Event, Texas, Miller got into a fight with his brother-in-law, John Coop. No one remembers what started the argument, but everyone remembers how it ended. Miller lifted his shotgun and shot Coop dead. The town was shocked. Deacon Jim? A murderer? Impossible. He was arrested and put on trial, but the evidence was weak, and Miller had friends in high places. He walked free, smiling politely as if nothing had happened. That was the moment he learned a terrible truth. He could kill and get away with it. And once he learned that, he never stopped. After that, Jim Miller's reputation began to grow. He traveled through Texas and New Mexico, always dressed sharp, always polite. He worked as a ranch hand, a lawman, and sometimes even a deputy. But his real job was one no one spoke about out loud. He became a gun for hire, a professional hitman. If someone wanted a man dead and had enough money, Jim Miller would do the job. He charged anywhere from $150 to $2,000 depending on the target. He worked quietly, efficiently, leaving no witnesses. He didn't brag, didn't boast, he just prayed and pulled the trigger. Most killers in the Wild West were loud, drunk, and reckless. Not Miller. He was calm, clean, and cold. He wore his Sunday suit to every job and polished his boots before every kill. People said he even read his Bible after every murder, as if asking God to understand. The strangest part was, many folks still liked him. He helped neighbors fix fences. He gave money to the church. Children waved at him when he rode by on his horse. No one could believe the rumors that the smiling, soft-spoken man in the black coat was one of the deadliest killers in Texas. But some people knew. They had seen what he could do. They whispered his name in fear. Killer Miller. The man who prayed for forgiveness after every shot. By his late 20s, Miller had already killed several men, some for revenge, others for pay. And yet he was never convicted. Every time the law caught up to him, he had an alibi, a friend, or a technicality to hide behind. It was as if the devil himself was protecting him. Behind his polite smile was a man who believed in two things: God and his gun. He truly thought he was doing God's work, that the men he killed deserved their fate. He'd pray before every murder, whispering, "God, forgive me, but this is for the greater good." Whether he believed it or not, no one knows. But it made him one of the most terrifying men the West had ever seen. A man who mixed faith with blood. A man who made death look righteous. In time, the townspeople would learn the truth. But by then it would be too late. Because Deacon Jim Miller, the praying killer, was just getting started. The sun was hot over Pecos, Texas. Dust swirled through the streets like smoke from a dying fire. Men stood in the shade, watching every stranger who passed. Because in this town, everyone knew that trouble was always close, and often carried a shotgun. That summer, Jim Miller rode into Pecos with a slow, steady walk and that same calm smile. He looked like a businessman, not a killer. But inside the black coat, the steel plate still rested on his chest, cold, heavy, and unshakable, just like the man himself. He had come to Pecos for work. The town needed a deputy, someone who could stand against thieves and gunmen. Miller's manners and confidence impressed the mayor. He was hired, sworn in as a lawman, the kind who kept order with one hand on the Bible and the other on the trigger. For a time, things went well. He wore his badge proudly and kept his boots polished. He smiled at townsfolk, went to church every Sunday, and quoted scripture about peace and justice. But peace never stayed long where Jim Miller walked. There was another man in town, Sheriff Bud Frazer. He was everything Miller wasn't: loud, brave, and emotional. Frazer believed in real law, in fairness, not fear. And he didn't trust Miller one bit. At first, the two men tried to work together, but it didn't last. Frazer began to suspect that his new deputy was using the badge for darker reasons. Cattle rustlers were being shot mysteriously. Witnesses disappeared overnight. People whispered that Deacon Jim was still doing his old work, killing for money, only now he wore the law's star while doing it. Frazer confronted him one night outside the saloon. The sheriff's voice was hot with anger. "Jim, you think God's on your side, but you're no better than the men you hang." Miller didn't raise his voice. He just smiled and said softly, "Sheriff, every man meets his judge. Some meet him sooner than others." That was the beginning of a feud that would end in blood. Months later, the tension snapped. Frazer tried to arrest one of Miller's friends, a man suspected of murder. Miller stepped in, blocking the sheriff's way. Words turned to shouts and then to gunfire. Frazer's revolver flashed. 2 quick shots slammed into Miller's chest. He fell to the ground. Everyone thought Deacon Jim was dead. But then, to everyone's shock, Miller stood up. The bullets had flattened against the hidden steel breastplate beneath his shirt. He brushed the dust off his coat, calm as ever, and said, "Sheriff, looks like God isn't ready for me yet." Frazer stared in disbelief. He had just shot a man at point-blank range, and the man lived. That night, Miller became a legend. Some called him lucky. Others whispered he was invincible. From that day on, the town of Pecos was divided. Some stood with Sheriff Frazer. Others, mostly ranchers and outlaws, stood with Miller, the man who could not die. The feud turned into open war. Ambushes, threats, and surprise attacks followed for years. Frazer would ride into town and shout Miller's name, daring him to fight. Miller would wait, patient as a snake, and strike when the moment was right. More than once, Frazer barely escaped with his life. But Miller's reputation only grew. He was fearless, polite, and deadly accurate. He killed with the calmness of a preacher saying grace. In 1896, the long feud reached its end. Frazer had just returned to Toyah, Texas, where Miller now worked as a deputy. The sheriff was tired of the threats and rumors. He told his friends, "I'm going to finish this with Jim Miller once and for all." That night, Frazer walked into the local hotel where Miller was staying. Witnesses later said Miller was sitting quietly, cleaning his gun, when the sheriff entered. Frazer reached for his weapon, but Miller was faster. 2 quick blasts from his shotgun echoed through the building. Frazer fell, dead before he hit the floor. Miller calmly reloaded, placed the shotgun by his chair, and waited for the law to arrive. When questioned, he claimed self-defense. And once again, unbelievably, the court acquitted him. After the trial, people began to say Miller could not be punished by man or by God. He killed a sheriff and walked free. In some towns he was feared. In others he was admired. Women called him a gentleman. Children waved as he rode by. Men tipped their hats. No one could believe that behind that calm, smiling face lived a cold-blooded killer, but Miller knew what he was. He wrote once in a letter, "The Lord guides my hand. If I kill, it is because he wills it." To him, murder was a calling, a mission wrapped in faith. And because no law could stop him, he believed heaven itself must approve. After leaving Pecos, Miller began a new career, a professional assassin. He worked quietly for ranch owners, politicians, and even lawmen. If someone had an enemy, they could hire Deacon Jim Miller. He charged high, worked fast, and never left witnesses. He became a ghost who walked in daylight. He would arrive in town smiling, buy a room, pray in the morning, and by nightfall, someone would be dead. Then he'd disappear, leaving behind only silence and fear. He lived by 2 rules. Always wear the steel plate. Always pray before the kill. To him, each murder was a job. Clean, precise, and justified. To everyone else, it was evil beyond understanding. By the late 1890s, stories about Jim Miller spread all across the frontier. Some said he had killed over 50 men. Others claimed he had made deals with the devil. But Miller never bragged. He simply smiled and said, "A man's life is in God's hands. I'm just the messenger." He wore his reputation like armor, the same way he wore his steel plate. And while most gunfighters died young, Miller only seemed to grow more untouchable. He was feared by outlaws, respected by the law, and protected by both. No one dared to cross him. No one except fate. Because the next time Miller took a job, the next time he pulled that trigger, it would be for the last time. The story of Jim Miller was no longer a secret in Texas. Everyone knew the name Deacon Jim. They said he prayed more than any man alive and killed more than most soldiers. He wore a Bible on Sunday and a shotgun on Monday. To some, he was a holy man who believed in justice. To others, he was the devil disguised as a gentleman. But one thing was certain. Jim Miller had discovered a new kind of business, murder for hire. In the late 1890s, the Wild West was changing. Railroads stretched across Texas. Towns were growing. The law was trying to tame the chaos, but greed still ruled the land. Powerful ranchers and politicians wanted control, and they didn't always trust the courts to deliver justice. That's where Jim Miller came in. If a man wanted a problem taken care of, Miller was the man to call. He charged high prices, sometimes $150, sometimes $2,000, depending on who needed to die. He worked clean. He didn't boast. He didn't drink. He didn't leave witnesses. To those who hired him, he was quiet and efficient. To those who crossed him, he was death itself. He became known as the first true hitman of the American frontier, a man who turned murder into a business. The strangest part about Miller wasn't just that he killed. It was how peacefully he did it. He would kneel before every job, bow his head, and pray. He'd whisper, "Lord, guide my hand and forgive me for what I must do." Then he would rise, fix his tie, and go to work, polite, calm, and deadly. He truly believed God was on his side. He told friends, "I never kill without reason. The Lord knows my purpose." But no one could understand how a man could read the Bible at dawn and shoot a stranger before sunset. Even those close to him began to fear that his faith was no longer faith at all. It was obsession. Jim Miller wasn't like other gunfighters. He didn't fight duels. He didn't stand in the middle of the street with his gun drawn. He preferred ambushes. Silent, planned, and certain. He wore his steel breastplate under his shirt everywhere he went. It had saved his life more than once, and he trusted it like a shield from God. He studied his targets carefully. He watched their habits, their roots, their weaknesses. Then, when the time was right, he struck. Most times. He used his 10-gauge shotgun, the same weapon that had earned him the nickname Shotgun Jim. He fired once, sometimes twice, always from close range. He never missed. Afterward, he would calmly walk away, dusting off his coat as if nothing had happened. He'd ride to the next town, attend church, and pray again for forgiveness. In every town, Miller created the same illusion. He was polite, quiet, and respectful. He tipped his hat to ladies. He read scripture out loud to children. He offered help to preachers and farmers alike. He was the perfect gentleman, and that's exactly how he wanted people to see him. No one could imagine that the man who helped repair fences during the day could be the same man who murdered strangers at night. That dual life made him powerful, because while others were feared for their tempers or their wildness, Miller was feared for his calm. He didn't act angry. He didn't look dangerous. He simply was, and that quietness, that stillness, made him far more terrifying than any outlaw alive. In those years, Texas justice could be bought and sold like cattle. Sheriffs, judges, and politicians all had enemies. Sometimes those enemies vanished overnight. Many of those disappearances led back to Jim Miller. He worked for whoever could pay. Ranch owners feuding over land, corrupt officers settling scores, or even families seeking revenge. It was said that he killed 12 men in New Mexico alone, all for money. But his record was spotless. No evidence, no witnesses, no convictions. He always walked away free, and whenever someone asked about his work, Miller would just smile and say, "A man's life and his death both belong to God." By 1900, the name Killer Miller was known across the Southwest. Saloon stories painted him as an angel of death, untouchable and invincible. Some said bullets bounced off him. Others swore he could shoot the flame off a candle from 50 yards. Every rumor added to his legend. Every story made him more powerful. Even lawmen began to hesitate when they saw him ride into town. Because how do you arrest a man who smiles while you aim a gun at him, and calmly tells you he's already forgiven you for what you're about to do? Not everyone feared him. A few brave or foolish men tried to stand up to Jim Miller, but none lasted long. He had a memory like iron. If a man insulted him, threatened him, or even spoke badly of him in another town, Miller remembered. He waited, sometimes weeks, sometimes years, and when the moment was right, he returned. Each time the result was the same. One man dead, Miller free. He had mastered the art of patience and revenge. To him, killing wasn't rage. It was justice, done quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. As his wealth grew, so did his confidence. He began to believe he was untouchable. He wore expensive clothes, traveled on fine horses, and spoke in the calm tone of a man who feared nothing. When someone once asked him if he believed in hell, Miller replied, "No, sir. Hell is for men who lose their souls. Mine belongs to God." But behind that answer was something darker. A man who believed his every sin was forgiven before it was even committed. And that made him unstoppable. He didn't fear the law. He didn't fear death. He didn't even fear God. Because deep inside, he believed he was God's tool, the hand that carried out his vengeance. By the early 1900s, Miller's reputation had begun to work against him. Too many bodies, too many whispers, too many powerful men nervous about the man they had once hired. People were starting to ask questions. Lawmen were watching him more closely, and even his old friends began to worry that they might be next if they crossed him. But Jim Miller didn't slow down. He simply smiled, polished his boots, and took his next contract. It was another easy job, he thought, another man to kill, another prayer to say. He didn't know it yet, but that contract would be his last. By the year 1909, the legend of Deacon Jim Miller stretched from Texas to Oklahoma. He was no longer just a gunman. He was a myth, the polite assassin, the man who could not die. People said he killed more men than smallpox. They said bullets bounced off his chest. They said he never missed Sunday service, no matter how many people he killed during the week. Jim Miller liked that people talked. He liked the fear in their eyes. But deep down, he knew something most didn't. Every story, every legend, eventually ends, and his ending began with one man, A.A. Gus Bobbitt. Gus Bobbitt was a respected ex-deputy U.S. Marshal in Ada, Oklahoma. He was known as honest, brave, and loyal, the kind of man Jim Miller would normally avoid. But this time it wasn't personal. It was business. A powerful rancher named Jesse West, along with a few partners, had a problem. They claimed Bobbitt had cheated them in a cattle deal, but the truth was simpler. They wanted him gone, permanently. So they made an offer to Jim Miller, $1,700 to kill Gus Bobbitt. That was more money than most men earned in a year. Miller accepted without hesitation. He smiled, tipped his hat, and said softly, "The Lord moves in mysterious ways. To him, this was just another job, clean, quick, and righteous in his twisted sense of faith. On February 27, 1909, Miller prepared for the kill. He rode out under the pale Oklahoma moon, his shotgun resting across his lap. His black coat blended with the night, his expression calm and focused. He waited near Bobbitt's home, patient, silent, like a wolf in prayer. When Gus Bobbitt and his wife returned home by wagon that evening, the sound of hooves echoed softly against the dirt road. Mrs. Bobbitt carried groceries. Her husband was humming a tune, tired from a long day. Then, from the shadows, thunder. 2 blasts from a 10-gauge shotgun shattered the silence. Buckshot tore through Bobbitt's chest and arm. He fell, bleeding but still conscious. Mrs. Bobbitt screamed. Neighbors ran from nearby houses, shouting in confusion. Through the smoke, they caught a glimpse of a man in black riding away. Jim Miller, calm as ever, fading into the darkness. Miraculously, Gus Bobbitt didn't die immediately. He was carried inside, weak but alive. When the doctor arrived, Bobbitt could barely speak. But his final words were clear and strong. "Jim Miller shot me." Those words changed everything. For the first time, there was a witness, a dying man's testimony. The myth of invincibility cracked. The man who always escaped justice was now named by his victim. It didn't take long for the law to find him. A posse of deputies rode hard through Texas and Oklahoma, hunting the famous killer. They found him in Ardmore, staying calmly at a hotel, reading his Bible as if nothing had happened. When they surrounded him, Miller didn't resist. He simply looked up, smiled, and said, "Gentlemen, I suppose you're here about Mr. Bobbitt." He handed over his gun politely, even straightened his collar before being handcuffed. The calmness of his voice chilled everyone in the room. He wasn't afraid, not of the law, not of death, not of anything. He truly believed he would walk free again, just as he always had. They locked him in the Ada, Oklahoma jail, along with his accomplices, Jesse West, Joe Allen, and Barry Burrell. The people of Ada gathered outside the building, whispering, glaring, angry. This time the town was not going to wait for another trial to fail. But Miller sat quietly in his cell, reading the Psalms. He smiled at the guards, asked for his meals politely, and even led the other prisoners in prayer. To everyone else, it looked like repentance. But those who knew him said his eyes still carried that same cold certainty, the belief that God was on his side, even now. He told a deputy one evening, "You can't hang a man the Lord protects." It was the same calm arrogance that had saved him for years. But this time, something was different. The people outside were not waiting for the Lord. They were waiting for justice. By midnight, a crowd had gathered outside the jail. Hundreds of men, ranchers, farmers, merchants, even preachers, filled the street. They were angry, tired of killers walking free. The law had failed too many times. Someone shouted, "Let's do what the courts never could." The sound of boots echoed against the dirt as the mob pushed through the doors. Gunfire cracked in the air. The jailer backed away, powerless against the tide of fury. The men stormed inside, dragged Miller and his 3 partners from their cells, and marched them through the streets toward a barn on the edge of town. The legend of Killer Miller was about to end, not in court, but in a rope. The last words inside the barn. 4 ropes hung from the rafters. The mob gave Miller a moment to speak. He didn't plead. He didn't pray. He just looked at the crowd and said with a strange, confident grin, "Let her rip." Those were his final words. A moment later, the floor fell away. The man who had cheated death for decades finally met it face to face. He died instantly, calm, silent, and smiling. When the morning sun rose over Ada, 4 bodies swung gently in the cold breeze. The people of the town went back to their homes, knowing that justice, for once, had been done. No trial, no judge, no jury. Just the rough justice of the frontier. And as word spread across the country, so did the end of the myth. Deacon Jim Miller, the polite killer who wore a cross over his heart and steel beneath his shirt, was finally gone. But his story didn't fade. It became a warning, a reminder that evil doesn't always snarl or shout. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it wears a clean black coat and carries a Bible in its hand. Jim Miller believed he was chosen by God, but in the end, it wasn't God who came for him. It was the people. The night Jim Miller died, the town of Ada, Oklahoma, did not sleep. For hours after the mob left the jail, Voices filled the dark, shouts, prayers, and whispers mixing with the creak of the gallows rope. The air smelled of dust and smoke and something colder, finality. When the sun rose, the townspeople walked quietly to the barn at the edge of town. 4 bodies hung side by side, swaying in the morning wind. Among them was Deacon Jim Miller, the man who had once seemed untouchable, now just another dead outlaw. No sheriff had given the order. No court had approved the hanging. But no one felt guilty. The people believed they had done what the law could not. They had ended the reign of a man who killed for money and smiled while doing it. By sunrise, word had spread. Telegrams flashed across the Southwest. Newspapers printed the headline, "Killer Miller lynched by Ada mob. Outlaw meets his end." To some, it was a victory. To others, it was chaos. Reporters argued whether the mob had saved justice or destroyed it, but the people of Ada didn't care about opinions from faraway cities. They had seen the system fail too many times. Miller had escaped justice again and again, walking free after killing sheriffs, deputies, and honest men. So that night, they decided that justice didn't need permission. They took it back with their own hands, and in doing so, they wrote one of the most shocking endings in Old West history. Those who were there would never forget the sight. The barn was old, built for horses, not hangings. The ropes were thick, tied hastily to the wooden beams. The mob worked in silence. They didn't want speeches or tears. When Miller faced the crowd, he wasn't afraid. He stood tall, straightened his coat, and even adjusted his tie. Witnesses said he looked like he was about to attend church, not meet death. He smiled one last time and said, "Let her rip." Then with a single pull of the lever, the floor gave way, and Deacon Jim Miller, the man who had survived bullets, trials, and years of hate, finally fell. Some swore his smile never left his face, even in death. By the next day, the news had crossed Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Every paper carried the same story on a preacher-killer finally brought down by his own people. Some headlines called it frontier justice. Others called it a shame to the law. But no matter how it was told, everyone read it. People in small towns sat around campfires retelling the tale. In saloons, men lifted glasses to the mob that had ended Killer Miller's life. In churches, preachers spoke about sin and punishment, warning their congregations that no man, no matter how pious he appeared, could escape the truth forever. Jim Miller had been both a saint and a sinner, and now, in death, his story was too big to die. No one came forward to claim Miller's body. For 2 days he hung in the barn while people came to look, men, women, even children, all curious to see the face of the most feared killer in the West. Some said they felt satisfaction. Others felt pity. He looked smaller in death, almost peaceful, as if finally free from the weight of his sins. Eventually, a few friends took his body down. They buried him quietly in an unmarked grave, far from town. There were no prayers, no family, no tears, only silence, and yet that silence spoke louder than any sermon. The man who had once prayed before every murder was gone. The Bible he carried was found in his coat pocket, its pages worn thin by use. Beside it was a folded scrap of paper that read, "I have made peace with my Maker." No one ever knew when he wrote it, before his last job or before his last breath. After the lynching, Ada changed forever. It became known as the town that hanged Killer Miller. Visitors came from miles away to see where it happened. Locals sold newspapers, souvenirs, and even pieces of rope they claimed were from the hanging. For some, it was a mark of pride, proof that ordinary people could stand up to evil. For others, it was a dark memory they wished would fade, but it didn't fade. The story grew larger every year. In time, it became a symbol, not just of justice, but of the anger that built when law and order failed to protect the innocent. Even in death, Jim Miller's name carried power. People whispered it in saloons and around campfires. Children were warned about the man in black who prayed before he killed. Ranchers spoke of him as a ghost that still rode the night. Some even believed they saw him, a tall figure in a dark coat walking near lonely churches or graveyards, head bowed in silent prayer. Whether those stories were real or imagined didn't matter. In the minds of many, Killer Miller never truly died. He became part of Western folklore, a warning and a legend all at once. What made Jim Miller so unforgettable wasn't just his crimes, It was his contradiction. He prayed like a saint and killed like a demon. He believed God guided his hand, yet he used that faith to justify murder. Preachers struggled to explain him. Some said he was proof that the devil hides behind a cross. Others said he was what happens when a man confuses faith with power. In every church that mentioned his name, people asked the same question: how could a man love God and still love killing? No one ever found an answer. Years passed. The rope that hanged Miller rotted away. The barn eventually collapsed. But the story never stopped spreading. Writers, historians, and filmmakers all tried to capture the mystery of Deacon Jim. Some called him a psychopath. Others saw him as a man twisted by trauma and belief. Whatever he was, he became part of the American myth, the dark reminder that even in the land of cowboys and lawmen, evil could wear a smile, and somewhere in the quiet grave where Jim Miller lies, perhaps that smile still remains, because even now, more than a century later, people still remember his final words, words that echo through history like a cold wind across the plains. Let her rip. When Jim Miller's body was lowered from the gallows in Ada, Oklahoma, it might have seemed like the end. But for the Old West, it was only the beginning. Death had taken the man, but not his story. In the weeks after his lynching, whispers began to move like wind across the plains. Men in saloons, women at church, and children by the campfire all spoke the same name with awe and fear: Deacon Jim. Killer Miller, the man who prayed for forgiveness before every kill, had become a ghost that refused to rest. Every newspaper wanted his story. From Texas to Kansas, headlines told of the preacher assassin, the saint with a shotgun, and the polite killer who smiled at death. Reporters painted him as both monster and mystery. Some described his calm manners and Bible verses as signs of hypocrisy. Others suggested he was insane, a man who truly believed he was doing God's work. No one could agree on who Jim Miller really was. But everyone agreed on one thing: he was unforgettable. Stories exaggerated quickly. Soon, people said Miller had killed over 50 men, maybe even 100. They said he could stop a bullet with prayer. They said the steel plate under his shirt was blessed by a preacher before every job. Each version of the story made him bigger, darker, more mythical. The truth was already buried, and the legend was being born. Out on the range, cowhands told tales of Deacon Jim to pass the long nights. They said he still rode through the deserts of Texas, wearing black with his shotgun strapped across his back. They said he prayed out loud before each storm, warning the winds to keep their distance. In one version, he became a ghostly figure who appeared whenever a man spoke false prayers, a spirit sent to punish the unfaithful. In another, he was cursed to wander forever, carrying the souls of those he killed. It didn't matter what version people believed. Each story carried the same message: beware of the man who hides sin behind faith. And so Jim Miller's memory became more than history. It became a warning, whispered from one generation to the next. As the decades passed, the Wild West itself began to fade. Trains replaced horses, cities replaced saloons, and the law finally began to settle the frontier. But people weren't ready to let go of the legends. They needed their outlaws, men who lived wild, died hard, and refused to be forgotten, Hollywood noticed. When Western films began to rise in the early 1900s, screenwriters looked to real stories for inspiration.
And who could resist the tale of a man who carried a Bible and a shotgun at the same time?
Though few movies used his real name, many borrowed his image. The clean-cut killer, polite but merciless. A man who spoke of God before spilling blood. Characters like Frank Miller in High Noon and countless silent-era villains were modeled after him. Even the phrase, "the man in black," later used for gunfighters and anti-heroes, echoed the memory of Jim Miller's black coat and cold eyes. In a strange way, the man who once terrified the West had become one of its most iconic archetypes. Historians, preachers, and writers all tried to understand what Miller represented. Was he pure evil, or a reflection of a violent time when men believed killing could be holy? Some saw him as proof that faith can be twisted when mixed with pride and revenge. Others said he was a product of the world he lived in, a lawless land where justice had to be bought or taken. To believers, his story was a sermon about temptation. To skeptics, it was a lesson about power, and to storytellers, it was gold. The kind of tale that balanced perfectly between horror and fascination. because deep down, every listener wanted to know the same thing. Did Deacon Jim really believe he was right? In the years that followed, Miller's grave became a secret destination. Buried quietly in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, near the same cemetery as Billy the Kid, his resting place drew curious travelers and outlaws alike. Some came to curse him. Some came to pray for him, and some came to take a handful of dirt from his grave, believing it held power, the courage perhaps to face death without fear. No one knew if the stories were true. But that didn't matter. Every time someone whispered his name, the legend lived on. The strangest thing about Jim Miller's legacy was that many still saw him as religious. They couldn't separate the killer from the preacher. To them, he wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who believed he was chosen. Letters discovered years later hinted at his strange beliefs. In one he wrote, "God has a plan for every bullet I fire." That line sent chills through anyone who read it. It showed a man who had completely merged his faith with his violence. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of purpose, and that made him far more terrifying than the wildest outlaw. By the mid-20th century, Jim Miller's name was firmly part of Western folklore. Historians wrote books about him. Radio shows retold his crimes. TV series turned his life into moral lessons for post-war America. Every storyteller added something new, a quote, a detail, a rumor, until the line between man and myth disappeared completely. To some, he was a dark folk hero. To others, he was a warning about the danger of false righteousness. Either way, his story stayed alive because it touched something deep in the human heart. The idea that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it says amen. Today, historians still debate Jim Miller's true body count. Was it 10 men? 20? 50? The number no longer matters. What matters is what his story revealed, that faith without mercy can become a weapon, and that charm can hide cruelty. Over a century after his death, Deacon Jim remains one of the most haunting figures of the Wild West, not because of how he lived, but because of how easily he fooled the world. He taught people a truth they still whisper today. Beware the man who prays too sweetly, for his sins may be louder than his words. The year was 1909, and the rope in Ada had already done its work. But while Deacon Jim Miller's body was buried, his shadow refused to stay down. In small towns across Texas and Oklahoma, people still looked over their shoulders when they heard boots on gravel after dark. They whispered, maybe he's not really dead, because legends like Jim Miller don't end with a hanging, they echo. In the days that followed his death, Ada was uneasy. Cattlemen swore they saw a tall man in black walking near the old barn where he was hanged. A widow claimed she heard a voice outside her window whisper, "The Lord forgives, but never forgets." Even those who had helped pull the rope started to have nightmares. They dreamed of Miller standing before them, his black coat spotless, his hat tilted low, his lips smiling as he said, "You can't hang a man the Lord protects." Fear turned to superstition. Some townspeople began carrying crosses or tiny pieces of rope from the lynching, believing it would keep his spirit away. But it didn't. The story kept coming back, like a prayer you couldn't stop repeating. Newspapers could not let the story die either. The tale of Killer Miller sold papers faster than any gunfight. Reporters retold the story with new twists every month. One paper claimed he'd murdered 75 men. Another said he'd been part of a secret gang of hired killers who worked for Texas politicians. The truth got buried under headlines, but readers didn't care. They wanted the thrill, the chill, of a man who killed without rage and prayed for mercy right after. Publishers learned something important from Miller's story. Crime sold. And from that moment, a new kind of Western tale was born. Not about heroes with white hats, but about the men whose souls had already gone black. As years passed, technology changed, but the story stayed alive. In the 1930s, radio dramas brought Killer Miller back to life. Listeners sat by their sets as deep-voiced narrators said, "He prayed before he pulled the trigger," and smiled as the smoke cleared. Children listened wide-eyed. Mothers told them to turn it off. But it was too late. America had fallen in love with its monsters. By the 1950s, Miller's tale had joined those of Billy the Kid and Jesse James in dime novels and TV shows. Writers couldn't resist the contradiction. a man who went to church, then went hunting for souls. Before Miller, stories about killers were mostly warnings. After Miller, they became entertainment. People wanted to know what drove him. Was it money? Faith? Madness? They wanted to understand how a polite man with perfect manners could carry death so calmly in his pocket. Historians and journalists dug up his letters, his records, his trial notes. But the more they found, the less they understood. He was polite to guards. He donated money to churches. He never cursed. He wrote to his wife, "Pray for me, for I am the Lord's worker." And yet, the ground he left behind was soaked with blood. That puzzle, that terrifying calm, became the model for modern true crime storytelling. Every documentary, every podcast, every late-night TV special that asks, why did he do it, owes a quiet debt to Jim Miller. Churches in Texas still spoke his name in sermons. Preachers used him as a warning, the man who tried to mix God with murder. They told their congregations, "You can't pray your way into heaven while you're walking through hell." But some older folks, those who'd met him, shook their heads. They said Miller was just a man shaped by a cruel world, a boy who saw his parents murdered and learned that justice only came from a gun. Maybe he wasn't born evil. Maybe the frontier made him that way. Either way, his ghost didn't rest. Because every man who believes he's doing God's will, no matter the cost, carries a bit of Deacon Jim Miller inside him. Decades rolled by. The barns where he rode collapsed. The trails he traveled turned to highways. But in every Texas town, someone still had a story. An old ranch hand in Pecos claimed his grandfather once saw Miller's horse wandering the plains after the hanging, the saddle empty, but the reins held tight by unseen hands. A preacher in Fort Worth swore Miller's ghost appeared in his dreams, reading scripture in a calm voice before disappearing into smoke. Even children played a game called Killer Miller. One kid dressed in black and whispered a prayer before pretending to shoot. Parents scolded them, but they kept playing. Because in the end, the scariest stories are the ones that feel true. When Western films reached their golden age, Killer Miller's ghost slipped quietly into the screen. He was never named directly, but he was everywhere. In The Polite Killer, the preacher with a gun, the lawman who smiled before pulling the trigger. Actors like Lee Van Cleef, Robert Mitchum, and Clint Eastwood carried bits of him in their characters. Even modern anti-heroes, men who are both sinner and saint, owe their shape to the man who mixed Sunday faith with Saturday night murder. Through movies and books, Miller lived again, not as a man but as an idea. The idea that inside every hero hides the temptation to become the villain. More than a century later, people still ask the same thing. Who was Jim Miller really? A monster pretending to be holy? A broken man trying to balance his sins with prayer? Or simply a symbol of what happens when faith loses its heart? Historians can list his crimes. Writers can describe his smile, but no one can explain his soul. Because evil that hides behind kindness is the hardest kind to understand. And so, the echo remains, in every retelling, every campfire, every film. Each one ends the same way, with the image of a man in black, a Bible in one hand, a shotgun in the other, whispering before he fires, "God forgive me." Jim Miller's grave is quiet now. The stone is cracked, the name nearly faded. But every so often a traveler leaves a small Bible there, or a single shotgun shell, or a note that reads, "Let her rip." Maybe it's respect. Maybe it's fear. Or maybe it's just a way of saying that some stories never end. They just echo forever. Because in the heart of every legend, every outlaw ballad, and every whisper of the Old West, Deacon Jim Miller still rides, calm, smiling, and eternal. When people spoke of Jim Miller, they used two words again and again, calm and cold. He never shouted. He never cursed. He never lost control. Even when facing death, he looked peaceful, almost holy. That calmness frightened people more than any gun. Because how could a man pray with such devotion and kill with such ease? To understand Jim Miller, you can't just count his victims. You have to step into his mind, a place where faith and death lived side by side. Every monster begins as a child. Jim Miller's story started in pain. When he was just 8 years old, his parents were murdered in cold blood. He saw what violence did, how it erased life in an instant and left nothing but silence. Most children cry and move on. Jim didn't. Something changed inside him that day. He stopped showing fear. He stopped showing emotion altogether. To the people who raised him, he was a quiet, obedient boy. But behind his still eyes, he made a promise. No one will ever hurt me again. That's how killers are born. Not from rage, but from wounds that never heal. As an adult, Miller lived in two realities. In one, he was Deacon Jim, polite, well-dressed, a man of God. In the other, he was Killer Miller, cold, methodical, and efficient. Psychologists today might call it compartmentalization, the ability to split the mind into boxes. One side held his faith, the other held his violence. He never let them mix, at least not in his own head. When he prayed, he was sincere. When he killed, he was focused. He saw no contradiction because to him, they were both part of God's plan. In his mind, he wasn't evil. He was an instrument. Most outlaws in the Old West were wild, drunk, reckless, loud. Miller was none of those things. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't fight for fun. He lived for control. His life, his clothes, his words, everything was perfectly measured. That control made him powerful. He never acted out of emotion. Every move was planned, calculated. He didn't enjoy killing. He simply believed it was necessary. To him, murder was a task, a duty. He could shoot a man, clean his gun, wash his hands, and go to church the next morning without a trace of guilt. That was the secret to his power, a heart that didn't feel fear, and a conscience that believed it was clean. Religion wasn't just Miller's shield, it was his justification. He attended every church service, dressed in black, Bible in hand. He prayed before every murder. He told people he never killed without cause. He truly believed God guided his actions. He saw himself as a divine executioner, punishing men who deserved death. That belief turned his crimes into missions. It erased guilt. It made him unstoppable. He once said, "The Lord knows my purpose. Every bullet I fire finds the man it's meant for." Those words are chilling because he meant them. Faith in his hands wasn't salvation. It was permission. Outwardly, Miller was a perfect gentleman. He held doors open for women. He gave coins to poor children. He quoted scripture about kindness and forgiveness. This mask fooled everyone. People saw a man of values, neat, polite, trustworthy. They never looked deeper. That's how he survived for so long. Evil rarely announces itself. It pretends to be good, and Miller wore that disguise better than anyone. Behind his calm smile was a man who had built an entire identity out of lies. A mask polished by prayer and sharpened by hate. Every time Miller pulled the trigger, he proved something to himself, that he could decide who lived and who died. That kind of power is addictive. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed for confirmation, to remind himself that he was untouchable, chosen, above ordinary men. That was his high, and when people started to fear him, when even lawmen stepped aside, it only fed the illusion. He wasn't a murderer in his mind. He was a judge, and the world was his courtroom. Even at the end, when he sat in his jail cell waiting for the mob, Miller never begged. He smiled, prayed, and quoted scripture. He told the guard, "You can't hang a man God protects." He believed that until the last moment. When the noose went around his neck, he didn't flinch. He stood tall, smiled, and said, "Let her rip." Those weren't the words of a man afraid of hell. They were the words of a man who still thought he was right. Psychologists would call that moral delusion, a mind so certain of its own righteousness that it becomes immune to guilt. But in simple words, Jim Miller died exactly as he lived, calm, confident, and wrong. So, what can we learn from a man like Miller? That evil doesn't always come with madness or rage. Sometimes it comes with manners. Sometimes it sits in the front pew of a church, hands folded in prayer. Jim Miller's mind teaches a dark truth. When faith loses compassion, it becomes cruelty. When righteousness loses humility, it becomes tyranny. He wasn't a monster from birth. He was a man who mistook power for purpose. And that's why his story still matters. Because even today, in every generation, there are people who convince themselves that wrong is right, that sin can be holy if the cause feels just. They walk the same road Miller walked. They may not carry a shotgun, but they carry his certainty, and certainty without mercy is where evil begins. Historians can count his crimes. Psychologists can name his disorders. But no one can explain the calm in his eyes or the peace in his voice. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to warn. Jim Miller's mind was a mirror, showing the dark reflection of faith without love. He prayed to God before every kill, and perhaps in some way God wept for him every time he did. When the rope snapped tight around Jim Miller's neck on that April night in 1909, it didn't just end a man's life, it ended an era. The crowd that gathered under the barn rafters didn't realize they were watching more than a hanging. They were watching the Wild West die, one outlaw at a time. But even as Miller's body swung, the world beyond Ada began to shift. His death, brutal, raw, and without trial, left behind a question that haunted America for decades. Can justice exist without law? The lynching of Jim Miller shocked the nation. Newspapers from coast to coast carried the story. Some praised the mob's courage, others condemned it as savagery. The Chicago Tribune wrote, "Frontier justice has no place in a civilized land." But to the people of Ada, it wasn't murder. It was closure. They believed the system had failed, time and again, and Miller's endless escapes had proven it. So on that night, they took the law into their own hands. They didn't wait for judges or juries. They became the executioners, and history recorded their decision. The Ada lynching became one of the last great acts of frontier justice. It marked the end of an age when men delivered punishment with their own hands. In the years after Miller's death, lawmakers and judges began asking hard questions. The mob's actions had exposed the weaknesses of the system, how easy it was for killers to walk free. Courts started tightening their rules. Evidence laws improved. Sheriffs were given more authority to protect prisoners from mobs. And new federal oversight helped ensure that no man could be lynched without consequence again. Ironically, the man who ignored every law in life ended up changing the law in death. His hanging became a case study in American justice, how frustration could turn good men into vigilantes, and how vengeance could look righteous when the law failed to deliver. Even after the law evolved, fear didn't leave Ada. Older residents whispered that Miller's ghost still haunted the town, not as a spirit, but as a memory of guilt. Some of the men who pulled the rope later confessed they couldn't sleep for years. They saw his calm eyes in their dreams. They heard his voice saying, "You can't hang a man the Lord protects." Psychologists today might call it trauma. Back then, they called it a curse. The town tried to move on, but Miller's execution became part of its identity. Ada was no longer just a quiet frontier town. It was the place where justice came without mercy. The birth of moral reflection across the West. Preachers and teachers began using Miller's story as a moral lesson. They told their congregations, faith without kindness leads to destruction. Law without compassion turns to cruelty. In classrooms, Miller's name became an example of hypocrisy, a man who lived in church but died in sin. Children were taught that being righteous wasn't about praying loudest. It was about living honestly. He became a symbol of the danger of false faith, of believing so strongly in your own virtue that you stop seeing your own evil. Before Miller, men believed they could shape their own justice with guns and grit. After Miller, the world began to crave order. People wanted trials, judges, and fair punishment. The frontier was closing. The old ways, revenge, duels, and hired killers, were dying out. In their place rose a new belief, that true justice had to be earned through law, not fear. It was slow, painful progress, but Miller's story helped push it forward. His crimes and his death forced people to see what happens when law breaks down completely. Writers couldn't let go of him. In books and ballads, Miller was reborn as the moral outlaw, the man who killed for a reason, who believed in God while doing the devil's work. He wasn't portrayed as a wild brute like Billy the Kid or Jesse James. He was something scarier, a man who believed his evil was good. That idea fascinated people, because deep down it felt familiar. Every person who's ever justified a small wrong, a lie, a betrayal, a sin, could see a little of themselves in him. That's what made his story powerful. It wasn't just about murder. It was about self-deception. It showed what happens when a man confuses his will with God's. Historians today say that Miller's case helped shape early criminal psychology. Lawmen began to study motive more deeply. They stopped assuming every killer was driven by rage or greed. They started asking new questions. What does the killer believe? What story does he tell himself? That was the beginning of understanding moral insanity, the belief that doing wrong can still feel right, and that insight would guide detectives, writers, and psychologists for the next 100 years. All because of one man who prayed before every kill. Every era finds its reflection in Jim Miller. In times of chaos, people remember him as a warning. Faith without love is just another weapon. Power without conscience is another kind of sin. The people who hanged him believed they were doing justice. He believed he was doing God's work. Both sides felt righteous. Both sides shed blood. That is why his story still matters, because it asks a question no age can escape. When does justice become vengeance? Jim Miller's ghost doesn't haunt Ada because of fear. It haunts America because of what it revealed. It showed that law, faith, and morality are fragile things, that good men can do terrible deeds if they believe they are right, and that evil doesn't always come with rage. Sometimes it comes with prayer. Over a century later, when people visit the place where he died, they don't see a monster. They see a mirror, reflecting the eternal struggle between justice and revenge, between belief and blindness. Because in the end, Deacon Jim Miller didn't just die for his sins. He died showing what happens when certainty replaces conscience, when men stop asking if they're right, and only ask how to win. When the noose snapped tight around Jim Miller's neck in 1909, most people thought the story ended there. But history has a strange way of keeping its ghosts alive. Over a century later, Deacon Jim still walks the edges of America's memory. Part man, part myth, and part warning carved into the bones of the Old West. He began as a farm boy who lost everything. He became a lawman, a killer, a preacher, and finally a symbol. And long after his death, his story continues to whisper one truth: evil can look righteous, and faith can wear a mask. Even after the dust settled on the town of Ada, Jim Miller's name never disappeared. Writers couldn't stop telling his story. Newspapers revisited it every few years, each time painting him in a slightly different light. Some called him a villain, others a tragic soul, but one thing never changed. People were fascinated by him. Because Miller wasn't like other outlaws. He didn't rob banks or lead gangs. He didn't drink or brag or gamble. He killed quietly, politely, and with purpose. That calm, that contradiction, became the heartbeat of his legend. He was the outlaw who prayed before every murder, the killer who believed he was cleansing the world, and the preacher who smiled when the rope took him home. When the Western movie era bloomed in the early 1900s, Hollywood found gold in characters like Jim Miller. He inspired a new kind of villain, the polite, intelligent, cold-blooded gunman who believes he's the hero. You can see his shadow in countless films, the calm-talking killer who tips his hat before the duel, the preacher with a hidden gun, the lawman who crosses the line in the name of justice. Movies like High Noon, Pale Rider, and Unforgiven all carry his DNA, stories where the line between right and wrong blurs in the dust. Even modern thrillers and crime dramas echo his spirit, from charismatic hitmen to anti-heroes who justify every sin as necessary. Each of them is a reflection of Killer Miller, the man who believed that righteousness and violence could walk hand in hand. Historians still study him, not just as a murderer, but as a mirror of his time. He lived at the edge of two worlds, the dying frontier and the rising modern age. In him, people see the tension between faith and freedom, between law and vengeance. Books describe him as the last outlaw of the Old West, the man who marked the final chapter of frontier justice. And in a way, that's true. His death was the moment the West looked in the mirror and saw its reflection, not as a land of heroes, but as a land of contradictions. He forced Americans to confront the cost of their myths. He made them ask, what does it mean to be good? When good men kill? Even now, over 100 years later, some preachers still tell his story. In small-town churches across Texas and Oklahoma, they speak of the man who prayed with one hand and murdered with the other. His name appears in sermons about false prophets, about the danger of pride disguised as faith. They remind their congregations, Deacon Jim thought he was doing God's work. But God doesn't hire killers. Miller's life became a moral lesson, a parable told to warn the proud and the pious that belief without compassion becomes destruction. He turned into a symbol of what happens when men stop listening to their conscience and start believing they are chosen. In universities, psychologists and criminologists still mention him in lectures. They call him an early example of moral detachment, a man who could separate emotion from action so completely that guilt no longer existed. Some describe him as a sociopath shaped by faith, others as a man deeply traumatized by childhood violence. Whatever the cause, Jim Miller remains a puzzle, a man who lived by rules only he could see. And that mystery keeps his story alive. Because every generation finds new ways to ask the same question. How could someone so calm, so polite, be so cold inside? In Fort Sumner, New Mexico, not far from where Billy the Kid was buried, lies a small, nearly forgotten grave. The name James B. Miller is carved into the weathered stone. Most passersby don't notice it. But sometimes, visitors leave small tokens, a coin, a prayer card, or a shotgun shell. Locals say those who visit at dusk sometimes hear faint church bells, though there's no church nearby. Others swear they see a shadow of a man in black standing over the grave, head bowed as if praying. Whether ghost or imagination, one thing is certain: the memory of Deacon Jim Miller refuses to rest. Because men like him never really vanish. They live on in the stories people tell to remind themselves what justice, faith, and fear can do to the human soul. Today, Miller's story still inspires writers, filmmakers, and historians, not as a tale of gunfights, but as a psychological portrait of moral blindness. He's found in documentaries, podcasts, novels, and museum exhibits about the dark side of the Old West, and in every retelling, one truth remains: he wasn't the devil. He was something far more human, a man who believed too strongly that he could decide right and wrong. That's why his story endures. Because it's not just about one killer, it's about the part of all of us that justifies our worst actions by calling them good. If you walk through Ada today, there's little sign of what happened that April night. The barn is gone. The mob has faded into history. But in the quiet streets, the story still lingers, told in the wind, the dust, and the silence of the plains. Jim Miller's life reminds us that evil doesn't always come roaring on horseback. Sometimes it comes quietly, with folded hands and a prayer on its lips. He began as a boy who lost his parents to violence. He died as a man who became the very thing he once feared. And perhaps, in that final moment, standing under the rope, smiling as he said, "Let her rip," he finally understood what every sinner eventually learns: you can run from justice, you can hide behind faith, but you can never escape yourself.